We are about to begin drafting the pattern for this lady's doublet. Now, this particular doublet doesn't have a collar on it. It's sort of a hybrid between an actual like collared doublet and one of the embroidered waistcoat shapes. So it's got a body that will fit similar to one of those embroidered waistcoats, but then it also has separate skirts on it, and it will be lined and properly tailored. So these are all of the pattern pieces that I've already drafted. I've already fitted on the mannequin and adjusted the proportions to match the mannequin. Now, what I would recommend for you is just following the draft that is in the Modern Maker Volume 2 for the ladies' doublet with round skirts. And from there, you can make a toile and fit it. Now, this image right here, this is the muslin that I made, the toile that I made. And you can see that it fits kind of loose, but in the long run, it's actually relatively close to what I was expecting fit-wise. I did a little bit of adjustment on the depth of the back neck, but beyond that, any final fitting, I really need to wait until the garment's complete. What I see here, I have exactly what I need to really make the most of this pattern. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I don't have access to my pattern paper, as I explained earlier, so everything is drafted on brown paper. Now, I have the drafts here on brown paper, but of course it's drawn in pencil, which makes it very hard to see. So what I'm going to do is I have my measurements, my drafts here, and I'm going to redraw over it using a white pencil so that you can see in the video. Now, I have 3 tapes. In order to draft this, I have the bust measurement of my mannequin with the corset on. So that gives me a 37-inch bust. And then I have a 33-inch tape that I'll be using for the length. That's approximately between 5'6" and 5'7" in terms of height. And then with the corset on, I also will be using a 28-inch waist tape. So these are the 3 tapes that I need in order to draft. We will begin by just drawing a straight line using a little ruler. I always use this see-through ruler here. Along this line, I'm going to make a couple of marks based on the length. So I'll start with this mark right here. And this, in most of the pattern drafts in volume 2, this point is marked A, and it's the base of the center back neck. Sometimes it's marked up here, sometimes it's marked here. Both patterns will work. Both patterns will need the same amount of fitting and adjusting. The longer I work with this system, the more accurate it seems to be to start with my center back neck as my beginning point. So from here, I'll measure down the length, which in this case is LIM. Now that means 1 ditto less than half of the length tape. So I'll mark that length right here. And then right here at A, I will take my length tape and I'll make a mark inward from A. Now I draft sideways, so this is center back and the pattern is going this direction. My apologies if that's confusing to you. This is typically how I draft the main body of a garment. So I measure in from the center back neck, 1 ditto with the length tape, and now I can set that aside because I'm done using it for this pattern. The next tape that I'll need is the chest tape or the bust tape. Now this is a 37-inch bust measure, and this will make the remaining marks that I need for the upper portion of the body. Most things in the upper portion of the body are proportions of the chest. Now, this will vary quite a bit depending on the proportions of the woman on whom this doublet will go. Because, for example, the shoulder proportion is not always directly connected with the bust measurement. For example, a small framed woman with a very large cup size will have a proportionally narrow shoulder compared to the size of her bust. And while these measurements and proportions are created to accommodate a nice middle average of what a shoulder width should be in comparison to the bust, you may need to take more direct measurements to make sure that everything will come out well. The next measurement that I'll do is I will put the zero end of the chest tape here at A, and then I'll measure up for the high point of shoulder. Now in this case, that's 2 dedo, and that means C-I when it comes to reading the pattern manual. And then from here, I'll measure straight over, which gives me C-D-I. And that gives me the back neck width. Now I can also measure that same amount from my center back neck point up at a straight angle to that line. Both measurements are exactly the same. Now also in line with A, if I measure A straight out along here, that gives me also the shoulder slope on this particular draft. And that is not consistent for all drafts. It just happens to work out well for this one. So to measure the shoulder, I'll place the 0 here at the high point of shoulder where the neckline goes, and then I'll measure down to where O intersects with this line. So it's O and a half. And when I say a half, that means that it's 1/2 of a dedo, not half an inch or half a centimeter. Each dedo is different depending on the tape. Half of a dedo is the distance that we need right here. So I have my center back neck and back neckline here. And now I can draw the shoulder. And that's my back shoulder. The next thing that I'll do is I'll move down to find the bottom of the back armhole, and then also the regular bottom armhole level in general. So because a lot of people, when I mark the bottom of the back armhole, they'll measure across here thinking this is the chest level, and it's not. This is a high back armhole intersection point. So this is just, sort of the top of where like a fiddleback goes in 19th century clothes. The 0 end of the chest tape will go at A, and then I'll measure down S-I to find the level of the bottom of the back armhole. And then I will draw a line straight out from there. And also, now that I've found this point, I can connect the center back neck to that point as well, because the center back of this garment is slightly shaped and curved. Now that I've found this point here, I will mark a 90-degree angle at the top here. And then I will just by eye, I'll draw a nice, smooth, shallow curve. It needs to be a shallow curve. Don't bring it in too far here because then nothing's gonna match up at either point. In fact, it's better almost if you make it flat and then you can carve gently out whatever it is that you need for curvature later if you're worried about it. I typically just eyeball a curve here. If you want to know a percentage of curvature, if I put a straight line across here, it's about 5/8 of an inch inward at the maximum curvature. The next thing that I want to draw is the chest level, which depending on the type of garment and the placement of the armhole, this is somewhere between IQ to Q. So slightly less than 1/4 of the chest to 1/4 of the chest. And in some modern garments, it can be as much as 1/4 of the chest plus an inch or two. So it just really depends on what the fit of the armhole is. In this case, we're going 1 dedo less than 1/4. So IQ is that point. And I just draw this line as reference so that when it comes time to double check it before I cut it out, I have a reference for where the chest level should be that I can measure against the front. Now I'm going to come all the way down to the bottom. I'm done with the chest tape, and I'm going to pick up my waist tape. Now I'm going to draw this line right here, just perpendicular to the very bottommost point of this line. I'm going to place the 0 end of the tape here at center back, and I'll measure OI along the waist level, and that's OI with the waist tape. So 1/8 of the waist plus 1 dedo, and that gives me the width at the bottom. Now, many of the patterns as you look at them in manuals, will show this to be a curve so that we have a 90-degree angle here. But several of the extant garments actually show this to be cut as a straight line across the back. And I think that that's important because the way these garments fit, that drops the center back ever so slightly and gives a little bit of a smoother, longer line when you're viewing from the back. And it appears to be a little bit more like garments from the time period. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this as a straight line. And then if necessary, when I finally fit the garment, I might carve it up. I might leave it straight. I can't know until I have the skirts on the mannequin and the corset and the underpinnings with the pads, and then I'll be able to determine whether I need to shape this or not. For now, I'm going to leave it a straight line. Now that that's done, I can just connect this point along the side back here to this point at the waist. And I'll just draw that with a nice straight line. The last thing that I'll do is I'll grab my length tape and I measure this line because I need to know what this number is. And in this case, this is QII and a half. So I label that as length tape, QII half. Now that measurement will become important when I'm drafting the front because the length of the side is determined by this measurement here. Now the back is complete. Seam allowances are based on the chest measurement. So if I have my chest tape here, whether I'm working in millimeters or working in imperial, I'll measure the size of this. And this is just under 3/4 of an inch. So I can guarantee that I have about a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So if I want to be nice and clear for myself, I'll go ahead and draw in that 3/8 inch seam allowance. I don't really need to worry about it at the neckline because there's no collar. So in terms of seam allowance, it's somewhat irrelevant to really draw it in there. So I'm just going to leave it off of that point. Everywhere else though, I am going to put in my 3/8 inch seam allowance. So that's the back. I can label this back, cut to self. And when I say self, that just means the exterior fashion fabric. And then cut to interlining and cut to lining. Now I usually label my patterns so that I can have all of this information. That way if somebody else needs to borrow them, it's always there. I also will typically write a date on it. And so at this point, I'm just going to put March 2020. And the dress size, I'll just put there. Now this is optional. I'm making this for a size 10 mannequin. That's a fashion size 10. That's not a normal person size 10. But whether it's real or whether it's mannequin size, it doesn't matter. As long as I have a size reference written on the pattern piece, I'm good. With the back complete, we're going to start working on the front now. So then the front starts exactly the same way the back does, with a nice long straight line. Okay, just like that. And then I will make a perpendicular line at the top, and the intersection of that is considered A. It's my 0 point. Okay. From here, I'm going to start with just the chest tape, and I'm going to work the entire top of the draft. And then I'll switch to using the length tape to take care of this area. And then I'll switch back to the chest tape just to determine the length of the point. The first point that I want to find is the vertical. So it's horizontal here in the image because I always draft everything sideways, but in my head I consider this to be vertical and this to be horizontal because I know that I'm drafting it sideways. But I can start by putting the 0 end at A, and then I'll make a mark at I, a mark at S, a mark at Q, and a mark at SII, which is 1/6 plus 2 dedo. All of these together give me the main points that I'll then draw lines out from, and these all help me line up the important parts of the top. So I'm drawing that one. This is a really long one here. Out that way, and then this one. Okay, so I have high point of shoulder, shoulder slope, width of the front and depth of the front neckline. And we have the full pattern width from center front to side back seam, and then the chest level measurement. Now that I've got my verticals here, I'll begin drawing my horizontals. So I will place the 0 end at A, measure over 1/8, which is also O, and I'll make a little mark there. That's O. And at CII, I've just drawn this line out, but then I'll make this the same measurement that I made the back, which is O plus half of a dedo, which I'll label C-O and then half. The width at the front, if I measure right off of the baseline, ignoring the fact that the front curves in at the base of the neck, I'm just going to measure this full width at CSII, and that gives us the frontmost portion of the armhole. Next, I'll measure all the way out to the high point at the side back seam, which is TII. So that's 1/3 plus 2. And then along the chest level, I will measure QI, and that gives me the bottommost part of the armhole. Now that I have these points, I am going to start drawing a little bit here. So I've got that. And from the high point here, I'm actually going to, I've got CTII to the outermost point, and then I'm going to measure half a dedo to the inside. That's the seam allowance width. So that's why I have this little flat section at the top. So from the bottom of the armhole here, I'll draw up, and you can see that I'm putting the knuckles in the middle of this armhole so that I can cast the curve that way. And then I'll turn the paper, and I'll cast the curve this way. Making sure that as I come up into the shoulder, that I am having a 90-degree angle right here at the shoulder point. Okay. Now that I have that portion drawn, I'm going to measure down from the high point of shoulder and in for the width of the bottom neck. So I know that this length here, the depth of the front neckline, is going to be 1/6, so I can just make it match this line right here. And then I'll measure along that. The width of the front neckline needs to be DI and a half. So I'll measure CDI half, and that brings me to this point right here. Once I have that drawn, I can again put my hand in the middle of the curve and just draw a nice gentle curve up into the high point of shoulder there. Okay, so I have the whole upper portion drawn. Now, this is the beginning of the trickier section. What I need to do now is I need to determine the length, the side back edge of the front. So for that, I will grab my length tape, and I will remember this measurement here that I had on the back, the length of the side back seam. So what I can do is I have these right here together. So I'm going to hold this at 0. I'm going to measure to here, and I'm actually going to place the pencil on the tape right where it needs to be. And then I'm going to hold the tape against the pencil like this. So I'm making a little compass, and then I'm going to place this at the top point here, and then I will use the pencil like a compass, and I'll cast this line right here. So any point from here to here along this curve I know is the correct length to match the side back seam. The next thing that I'll do then, now that my length tape is done, I'm going to put it aside, and I'm going to grab up my chest tape, and I'm going to make a guideline. And this guideline is all about finding the center of the front waist so that we can measure outward from a center point. And what this does is it enables every size of woman to have the waist measurement proportionally sound to the other parts of their body. So if, for example, you have a smaller bust but a slightly larger waist, measuring from this point will change the pattern in a way that's still going to hang properly on your body. So we're finding a reference point that then allows this to come out or in perfect alignment with what your body is. So what I want to do is I've got my foundation line here, and I'm going to measure CSI. So that's 1/6 plus 1 dedo in from the foundation line. And then along there, along that line, or at that mark, then I'm going to draw a line. The next thing that I'll do then is I will grab the waist tape, and the front waist measurement needs to be WTD. So that's 1/3 plus 1/12. And if you're not familiar with these measuring tapes, D is the halfway point between T and M. So what T plus D is right here in the middle between T and M. So what I'll do then is half of TD is SI, because this is 1/3 plus 4, which means 1/6 plus 2 is our half of the waist measurement. So then I will find, I've got the center point here, SII, lined up on our guideline here. And I can move the tape up and down, but what I want to do is I'll keep that lined up, and then I'll find the point at which, with this lined up here, this hits that curve. And then I can measure here, and I'll make a mark, and I'll measure to the front, and I'll make a mark. And then along that line, where those marks are, is where I put the waist level. And really the waist level comes up from there, but this gives me the bottom point of the side back seam. So you can see how this arcs up and then comes back down, and that's just because we know that this side back seam is going to be at an angle to the body. So the true side seam is probably about here. Okay? So this will come up into where that true side seam is, and then it drops down into the point. So from here, I want to measure down to find what my point is. So I'll use my chest tape again, and I'll just make this D1/2. Now, that's my preference for this because I kind of like a nice short point on this style of bodice. If you want to have something a little bit more Spanish, you can make it a little bit deeper. But I think in general, keeping this a little bit short makes it, it can pass for Dutch, it can pass for English, it can pass for French. It passes for a lot of the regular, sort of Central and Northern European appearances in this time period. So this is a more general length right there. So to find this, I just kind of come down, straight down from where the front waist point is, and then out just a little bit so that I have a tiny bit of outward curve. And what that does is it sort of tilts the angle of the point out to accommodate the fullness of the skirts that are being worn underneath. And then I'll make the bottom of that 1 dedo wide, and that accommodates 2 seam allowances, one coming from center front and one coming from the skirt. And then from there, I'll make a nice smooth curve, once again trying to keep this 90 degrees at the side here. Now that I have that point, I can draw this, and I'm just going to draw this as a curve so that from this level up, I have a relatively straight line. The curve is important because the fullness that comes here will move at an angle up into the bust area of the front. It just gives a little bit of ease to where we need the bust line to be. And then from here, I'm going to curve out to the chest line and then back in to the neckline. And that's the shape of the front right there. We're already done. Our next task is to draft the sleeve of this doublet. Now the proportion of the top of the sleeve has already been determined by measuring the armhole, literally just measuring the cut edge of the armhole. But if you're drafting the doublet in proportions that I've given you, then these proportions of the sleeve cap should also fit the armhole quite well. So we start again the same way that we started all the others, with just a plain straight vertical line. Now vertical being sideways here in front of me, and the widths being this direction. At the top here, which is on my left, I'm going to draw a perpendicular line. I'm going to label that A. Now all of the lengths, which is not that many, but there's a couple of length points that I need to mark. So I'll place the 0 end at A, and I'll measure down to TT. Now that brings me to the level of the frontmost part of the wrist, and then below that, I'll measure TTII, which gives me the drape of the back point of the wrist. And then from there, I will use the chest tape to measure the remainder of this cuff. So this is the actual length of the sleeve right here, and then the cuff bends back. And on top of that would be worn like a set of cuffs or like linen cuffs with lace on them. Now that I have that, let me make the mark for the elbow, which if I'm measuring from the top here, that's TII. So that's 1/3 plus 2 dedo right there. I can remove the length tape from the work now because it's complete. And I'm just going to take these marks that I've made and draw lines out from them. Okay, the next thing that I need then is the chest tape. I'll finish out this area down here at the bottom. So to get to the very bottommost part of the sleeve is going to be CI half. So 1 dedo plus a half dedo of the chest tape. And then from this point right here, from this last line, I'll measure CII, so that's 3.5 to get to here. And then I will draw my line out and draw this point here, and then using the chest tape, I'll just mark the width. So the wrist here needs to be OI half, and I will make the OI half line up over here and then place the 0 along the line. You could do it the other way if you want to. Now that I have that line, I can connect this front wrist point and I can connect the back. The width of the back being, this is OI along here. So I have the shape of the back of the wrist here, but I actually need to do some measuring to figure out the front of the sleeve. So I have my elbow point here and I've drawn my line. I have my top line here. So let me finish out the top of the sleeve and then I'll work my way to the middle and then we'll finish out the length of it. Place the 0 end at A and make a mark at I along the line. That gives us the point of the frontmost dip of the cap of the sleeve. Then I'm going to make a mark at O and a half here, And that gives us the very top of the sleeve. And then I'm going to find the height of the back point, and that's 1.5. That's CI half down from A as well. CI half to here. And then I will draw this line out. Now the full width of the cap of the sleeve is CQI half. So I'm going to measure that to here. And then I've got this point here. And now I have the points for the top of the sleeve that I can just draw this nice soft curve. Okay, that gives us the top there. And now what I'll do is I'll have this point here and this point here, and I will connect them with a straight line. Then I'll place the zero end at the topmost point of the cap, and I'll place the tape, I'll lay the tape so that it's perpendicular to that line that I just drew connecting these two dots. And then I'll measure D to get across that, and that gives us the width of the cap opening. And from there, I'll measure a seam allowance up along this curve, right? I'll just measure whatever seam allowance width is here, so it should be half a dedo. So that comes to there. Then I'll measure half a dedo up along here, and then I'll connect those points with the bottommost point of the armhole. So now I have the shape of the sleeve cap opening. Now that I have that, I can connect this front point with whatever my elbow point needs to be. So my elbow curvature is also determined by the length tape. So if I place the zero end here at TII, then I'll measure inward to LIII. So I'll place the zero end there. I'll measure in, that's III, right? And then I'll make a little mark. And now I can connect this to here. And then I'll follow that line all the way through in a smooth curve down till the front point of this hits the line here. And then at my LTT point, I just measure into wherever it intersects with that curvature, and then I have my front wrist point. So now this gives me the bend point of the turn back. So this is all cuff that's turned back. This is the actual bottom of the sleeve when it's worn. So all that remains for me to do is to plot the back of the sleeve. And to do that, I just need to find the width of the elbow. Once I find that, then I can just draw that back curve. So the width for the elbow is CSI half. So I'm going to mark that here, and then I'll place the zero end at my front elbow point, and I'll measure toward the back, CI half, and now I have the elbow width. So from here, I will curve in slightly and then bump back out at the elbow, and then curve in again, running smoothly into the wrist. Now that I have the outline of the sleeve drawn, the next thing that I should do is mark my notches. And this is important for a sleeve because you have to have front notches, back notches, elbow notches, and then you want this notch right here, which tells you how much of the sleeve to leave open so that you can have a little hook and eye or a button that holds this closed. So in this case, it's DI using the chest tape. So that measures up to there. So from here up it will be closed, and then from here down it will be open. And the foreseam here at the front of the arm will be closed all the way. And this should give us a nice sleeve that has enough flexibility to just simply unhook it, get your hand through, position your lace and cuffs and everything, and then fasten it closed again. Now, a 3/8 inch seam allowance is included around all edges on this pattern. And the nice thing about having the fold back at the bottom is that you can adjust where the sleeve length is if you need to. Our next task is to draft the skirts of this doublet. And to do that, we'll need the length tape and the waist tape. So I'll just take my ruler here and I'll draw a straight line here. And then I'll turn my ruler and I'll draw a straight line at right angles to it. I'll use the waist tape and I'll place the 0 end here at the intersection, and then I'll measure QI and a half. And that gives us 1 point. And I'll measure the same along here, QI and a half. And then, because we're casting a quarter of a circle, I can put this tape here, but I'm going to make it half a dedo shallower. And that's because we're changing the curvature so that it will sit well with the dip of the front point. Now that we have those points here, I can connect the dots with a curve, and that should, if we've done our job right, that should be really close to the measurement of the front bodice. So to check that, I'll just line the point up here, and I'll place this right along that curve and check it. So we're about 1/8 of an inch larger, and I'm just going to leave that because with the shaping and the seam allowances and all the tailoring, things are going to shift as we work, and we can always adjust later. But for now, I'm going to leave that extra 1/8 inch because I think it'll be perfectly fine. The next thing that I'll do is I'll take the length tape and I'm going to measure the length of the skirt. So from here to here, I have LIQ. So that's with the length tape, and that's 1 dedo less than a quarter of the tape. So 0 to here, or I can just shift the tape to I along there and just make a mark at Q. I'll do the same thing along this edge, and I will move to I and then make a mark at Q. Now that I have that, I can measure the width here, and I'll do it in several places along the curvature so that I know exactly where I need to be. Notice that as I spin this tape around, I'm making sure to put the mark very perpendicular to the edge. Oh, this is going to be so much easier if I turn this around so that my body is on the inside of the curve. There we go. Now the only thing that I need to do is just tweak the shape slightly. What I'll do is I'll just measure out a little bit from each right angle. So there's actually slight bit more flare. And with that, I'll just measure 1 dedo out. And I'll come over here and I'll measure 1 dedo out. And then I'll use my ruler and I'll draw that line. And this pattern piece is done. Moving on to the back skirt. I'm going to do this here. Now, I know that I'm going to just double this because this back pattern piece is quite symmetrical. So I'll just fold the paper in half and I'll measure along the fold, and this will be like a center line right here. The length is going to be the same as the front skirt, so LIQ. So I'll just make a mark here at 0. I'll shift over so that my eye is right on that mark, and then I'll make a mark at Q. And that gives me the length that I need for this pattern piece. Then I'll take my waist tape and I'll place the 0 end at the fold, and then I'll measure out to where this point is. And that's going to be WII and a half. So 3.5 dedo gives me the width that I need right here. And then I'll measure 1.5 dedo up, 1.5 waist dedo up from the bottom, and that line will be used to determine the width of the bottom of the back skirt. Here I'll place the 0 at the fold and I will measure out, and I have WS plus half. So 1/6 plus half a dedo gives me the width that I need along here. So I have to draw this line. That gives me the side of the skirt. But then I want this to be a 90-degree angle. So I have to drop down and I'll curve slightly because this also needs to be 90-degree angle there. This needs to be 90 degrees and then this needs to be 90 degrees. You can see that it just naturally sets up these curvatures that I need. If I'm just paying attention to creating 90 degrees around all of my edges, it naturally sets up my curves so that I know what I need. And that's the back skirt.